This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Yves Engler. Today, we're going to be discussing this demonstration 1 week ago, last Friday, demonstration against NATO that has been getting a whole bunch of discussion, become a global affair, and to discuss this demonstration, some broken windows, a student strike, police apparently burning a car, putting a car on fire, a global condemnation of Montreal's Kristallnacht. We have Alex Tyrrell, who is the leader of the Green Party of Quebec and one of the organizers of the counter summit against the NATO Parliamentary Assembly that met in Montreal from Friday, November 22nd to Monday, November 25th. Thanks a lot for coming on, Alex. The first question I have, I guess we'll just discuss a little bit about the NATO question. So as I wrote in a piece, I think that because some windows were busted on the Friday night in this big demonstration of more than 1,000 people, the media gave way more attention to the critical discussion about NATO, and you were one of the people involved for a while in mobilizing. Can you give us a little bit of your assessment of the NATO question, this NATO assembly, and some of the organizing that went into the counter summit?
Sure. So last weekend we had the NATO Parliamentary Assembly taking place in Montreal. So really parliamentary delegations from all of the NATO member states and also the partner nations, including Israel, were gathered in Montreal at the convention center for a 4-day meeting. And myself, as well as some people with the Canada-wide Peace and Justice movement, as well as Mouvement Québécois pour la Paix, came together and organized what we called a counter summit. So it was a day-long conference with many speakers that are very critical of NATO, including yourself, Yves, and also some international support. So we had Medea Benjamin, the founder of Code Pink, sort of one of the superstars of the American anti-war movement. We had Sivim Dagladin, who's a German MP that's very outspoken critic of NATO. So we had those conferences planned for the Sunday, as well as a protest called on Saturday afternoon by the Mouvement Québécois pour la Paix. But on Friday, so the first day of the summit, as you mentioned, there had been some student strikes in solidarity with Palestine, and there was a large protest organized at night in downtown Montreal, in which some people broke some windows. There was a bit of a black bloc contingent, and so I was present at this demonstration. It started in front of Place des Arts. We marched down towards René Lévesque. To the Chinatown area. There was some windows that were broken at that point, and some little minor scuffle with some riot police, which actually ended up pulling themselves back from the protest under the pressure, I guess, that they felt. We marched a couple more blocks to the Montreal Convention Center where the NATO gathering was being held. At that time, there was about 6 windows that were broken. For those who are familiar with the layout of the convention center, there's sort of a street tunnel that passes underneath. So the protest was in this tunnel of the convention center when the windows were broken. There was some tear gas deployed. So I was in a crowd of hundreds and hundreds of people, who were not the ones who broke the windows. Those people were much further away, but we were gassed, and we were attempting to get away from this gas. But the riot police actually sort of kept us in the demonstration. Like when we came out of the tunnel at Palais des Congrès, a lot of people wanted to disperse at that point, but they were blocked from doing so by riot police who forced us to continue in the direction of the protest, where we faced additional gas. And I walked a few more blocks, and then I was able to turn down a street. And I had skipped a couple of streets because there were police that appeared to be blocking them. Finally, I went down a street despite the fact that there were some police on it. I managed to get through them and and leave that way. I took a Bixie, I turned around, I came to re-meet up with the demonstration. At that point, I saw there was about 60 people left that were walking, and right when I was on the corner, the bicycle police gave themselves verbally the order to cut this group in half. And so they went into it, they cut in half, and they detained about half of the people in what I thought was a kettle. But it seems that now, since some of the laws that they used to use to kettle people have been invalidated by the courts, they detained some people, and I guess they investigated. They ended up arresting three people, some of whom were charged with obstructing the police. And I assume that in this case, the obstructing the police would mean like tipping over construction cones behind the protests, I guess, to obstruct the police from doing their work. So who would have thought it would be a criminal offense? But people should be aware that that's something that can happen. So this whole protest took place, right? It's not really that out of the ordinary for Montreal because there's often protests in which a handful of windows will get smashed and riot police will intervene. But what was really incredible was the dimension that it took on online. We had like the Prime Minister of Canada, the Foreign Affairs Minister, saying that this was a
Can we actually
violent.
get to that in a second? I want
Yeah, sure.
to step backwards onto some of the tear gas question. Okay.
Yeah.
I was there. I actually had my 2-year old in a stroller, and
Mhm.
when going into the demo, I presumed it was going to be a raucous protest. It was a night demo. It was the convergence de lutte anticapitaliste. The messaging they had was like a boot into NATO, block NATO. The whole structuring, the messaging was that it was going to be a raucous affair. Personally, once things started escalating, I moved a good block away from the protest, kind of like where the windows get smashed in the underpass. I move a good block away, so I'm kind of a ways away. Now I and I increasingly move further away as there's tear gas. A good
Mhm.
2 blocks away from where anything's going on, there's tear gas in the air. I'm walking towards Old Montreal, and there's people, just passerbys, probably tourists even coming from Old Montreal down, and they're like feeling the tear gas in there. And obviously, because I have the little one, I'm trying to get out of there as quick as possible because the chemical irritants. So we have a question about how many canisters of tear gas were launched. We don't know. There has been, as far as I know, the police haven't stated it. Now, they initially said one of these cars, two cars were burnt. They initially blamed the protesters. Now it looks pretty clearly that it was actually a police tear gas. The main car that's all the images of burning, it was actually the police tear gas canister that did that. So can you tell me, first of all, a little bit about what we know on that, but also your experience back in 2015 when the Montreal police did sort of something similar and burnt a car, put a car on fire with its tear gas, and actually there was actually children inside. But can you give a little bit about the tear gas question before moving on to the whole Zionist
Sure.
backlash question?
Yeah, sure. So that's it. So they've been using these tear gas canisters in Montreal for some time, and from what I understand, it's called a scat shell. And so essentially, this is a tear gas canister that's fired from like a small cannon, I guess that they hold. It goes up, and then when it's in the air over the crowd, there's a detonation. It breaks into four different pieces, and then these four pieces have separate canisters in them, and they go and they fall down into the crowd. And these canisters, are burning, right? It's the combustion of the canister that makes the tear gas. It's not as if the gas was in a pressurized cylinder and is let out. The gas is generated by combustion. And as a result, if you look at the manufacturer's data sheet for this product, it says that there is a fire-causing capability, and it recommends not using these canisters in places where they could create fires. For example, they give the example that if one of these four canisters would land on a rooftop, for example, it could set a building on fire. And they recommend that when, first of all, they not be deployed against barricades or in these urban environments, but also if they are, they recommend that there be a spotter in place that will go and make sure that, look at where these things fall and put them out if they cause a fire. So when I heard that some vehicles were burned, this immediately came to mind because back in 2015 at a May Day protest, I was watching while riot police on St. Catherine, there was protesters going the wrong way against traffic. There was people stopped in their vehicles in the middle of the street waiting for the protest and riot police to clear. And basically, the riot police launched this thing over the crowd. It exploded, it came down, and one of these forecasters landed on an SUV between the hood and the windshield. So that little plastic area there caught fire. And inside this SUV, there was a mother and her two young children who were forced to jump out of the car. Actually, they were filming while this happened, and the video is available. They were inside the car. It fell right on the windshield. The car started catching on fire. They had to get out in the middle of a riot police intervention. I was watching from inside of a store. The line of riot police came by. They swept across the vehicle. They did not put out the fire, and we were watching from inside as this, small fire continued to expand. Eventually, some protesters came and poured a bottle of water onto it, and they managed to put it out. But it still was risky. If nobody would have put it out, it would have been the entire car that would have burnt. And also, from speaking with the woman who owned this vehicle, it turns out that it was not covered by insurance because a lot of insurance policies have an exclusion for civil unrest. And so she was trying to obtain compensation from the police for what they did to her vehicle. I don't know if it actually panned out or not for her, but this is the same kind of shell, right? And they know that it's dangerous, right? They know that there's a fire causing potential. And so when I saw that, TVA, one of the right-wing outlets, published some photos suggesting that, this was in fact a fire that was set by the police equipment. It just confirmed what I had predicted from beforehand. And they've published the images. You have a car with a hole in the passenger side window about the size of the canister. They found the canister inside the vehicle. Okay. And when you look at the videos of the
This
vehicle
is Friday
burning,
night's NATO demo, just to make it.
Friday night, yeah. You look at the video of the car burning, there's really a lot of smoke, but not much flame. Well, that's the tear gas is it's not actually smoke, it's tear gas that's inside the vehicle. The riot police came, they put it out with the fire extinguisher, and there's a photo of the car after it burned, and it's really just the passenger seat that seems to be damaged. So this thing came through the window, burned on the passenger seat, and was put out by a fire extinguisher. Meanwhile, the police know this, right? But they say after the protest that it was protesters who lit the car on fire, when in fact it appears that it was the police that lit the car on fire.
And they've now subsequently kind of backtracked and said, we don't know who lit the car on fire. That's
Well,
one.
that's it. So now they can't confirm or deny, but this is one of the tactics that we've seen, over and over again in many demonstrations where the initial shock, of anti-NATO protesters, or worse, anti-Jewish, as they like to call it, there, set a car on fire in downtown Montreal, and we have like the Conservative Party of Canada leaders saying Montreal is burning and all of this exaggeration. And then we're going to find out, like, okay, 3 days later, they say maybe it wasn't them. And it'll probably be 2 weeks before they say, okay, now finally, no, we did set it on fire, right? But by then, it's going to be too late. The news cycle is going to have moved on, and the blame in any case has already been placed on the protesters.
Yeah. And so, okay, another thing I just want to just touch on quickly is that there were injuries. There's somebody got by the cops here. They busted some guy's finger. There's a couple people who went to hospital. There's somebody's been hit in the head with a matraque, a baton. So there are protesters injured. That's been reported now by the CBC. So I think it's important to also bring this into the mix. That has gotten almost no attention, that the police did, not just in terms of all the people who got the chemical irritants, and those are some people who were at the demo, and then many people who were just in the street, but also people were injured fairly substantially by the police as well. Now, let's move on to this sort of second part of this. Okay, so this has a NATO thing. You were involved in mobilizing around this NATO summit for weeks and weeks, months even. From the NATO standpoint, I think that they got the Saturday protest, the next day, the counter summit, all got way more media attention because of the broken windows. Some of that media attention actually was quite sympathetic. Was two sides kind of fairly fair. Now, on the other side to this whole equation, now part of why the Friday demonstration was as big as it was because there was a student strike for Palestine. I think a historic student strike for Palestine. I don't know of an example. The Quebec student movement has a very impressive history of mobilizing its tuition. Even back in 2002, I was involved in a student strike against the free trade area of the Americas. We had a one-day student strike and a huge demo in Montreal I was actually involved in mobilizing for a year. We went to the World Social Forum in Brazil. And so it was a hemisphere-wide student strike, and it was a pretty big mobilization. Now, that was an international focused student strike in a sense, but it was more focused on sort of privatization of education tied to the free trade area of the Americas and neoliberals and stuff like that. So it had an internationalist element and then a more kind of domestic element. This Palestine student strike that took place on Thursday and Friday of last week had more than 40 associations, student associations, representing more than around 85,000 students that all voted to go on strike, to call on their institutions to cut off all relations with Israel. That was the call, and also to denounce some of the repression at McGill and Concordia specifically. So this is a big student strike. On Thursday, it was a big demonstration at Concordia, more than 1,000 people. Dawson College was shut down. Some of the other cégeps, I believe, Dawson's the biggest college in Quebec, was shut down for the day. Some of the other cégeps I heard were also shut down for a day. Now, this student strike then feeds into the anti-NATO mobilization. At UQAM on the Friday, they have workshops all day. Apparently, I didn't go, but apparently they were well attended about kind of, Palestine, NATO, and sort of broader geopolitical questions. They then have a demonstration that leaves from Émile Gamelin, the park that's well known for the 2002 student strike right next to UQAM, the Université de Québec à Montréal, and it marches over to the demonstration at Place des Arts, and it feeds into the Place des Arts Friday nighttime demonstration. So the student strike is a part of why this demonstration was as big as it was, but it's also separate. Neither of these things were. The NATO summit goes back months that this was planned. The student strike also goes back months, and they just so happen to coincide on the same day. Now, the reaction immediately to the windows being broken and the sort of raucous protest is principally from Zionist forces, and they just go completely bananas on X principally, but in social media, and they start referring to this as like a Kristallnacht, Montreal's Kristallnacht, and they basically say this is all just a Hamasites. They have has nothing to do with NATO, the actual NATO assembly, where the windows were smashed at the convention center where the NATO assembly was being held. So yeah, can you just kind of give us a little bit about a bit more about kind of that element of how it just got hyped beyond belief from prominent influencers in Israel, in the US, all over globally of this sort of condemnation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, like within the Canadian political and media establishment, there seems to be no acknowledgement of the existence of any criticism of NATO ever, anywhere. So, of course, this is a protest against NATO, so they start branding it as something else immediately because criticism of NATO doesn't exist in Canada, according to them, right? Also, they tried to just turn this thing into saying that it was an anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic march, that it was violent anti-Semitism in the streets of Montreal and that kind of thing, which is a complete fabrication and distortion of what took place. Like, to have Melanie Joly, for example, the foreign affairs minister, condemning violent anti-Semitic protests in Montreal and vowing to crack down and stuff like that. Like, this was not a violent protest, and it was not anti-Semitic, that's for sure. There was no anti-Semitic chants that were shouted. The most common chants were things like "Free Palestine" and that kind of thing. Of course, people were making the link between the Israeli government and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I mean, they did have a delegation there and everything, and there are some strong links between NATO and Israel. Of course, a lot of the weapons that are supplied to Israel come from NATO countries and are NATO compatible weapons. So that's it. So there's a complete exaggeration, a complete distortion of what took place, and it's really incredible that people like Justin Trudeau or Melanie Joly will go and say to the world that there's violent anti-Jewish demonstrations taking place within their own country. It gives a bad reputation to Montreal and to Canada as a whole. And it's very similar to what we saw in Amsterdam with the whole soccer riot situation where, look, you have soccer matches every so often. There's brawls between fans. They said that it was, compared it almost like to the Holocaust and stuff like that. The mayor of Amsterdam
Over.
completely,
Use the word
com
over.
yeah, completely exaggerated, right? And fabricated even. In that case, like the Israeli soccer fans had, started chanting genocidal chants and stuff like that. And there were some brawls that broke out, but it's not really that exceptional. And, to go around and say internationally that, your city is filled with anti-Jewish hate and that kind of thing is very damaging. I heard the mayor of Amsterdam's had to apologize since then, but they really seized on this opportunity to sort of do Amsterdam 2.0 and to like fabricate this false narrative about what took place.
And the Montreal police, who had again injured many of the a number of demonstrators, had tear gassed, had basically been in this conflict with the demonstrators. They come out. You have a situation where like Trudeau and Joly are claiming it was an anti-Semitic event, and the Montreal police are coming out and saying, "Well, we didn't see any incidents of anti-Semitism." And nor have we received any complaints about incidents of anti-Semitism. So you had a situation where the Montreal police were essentially defending the demonstration from who they just basically repressed from the global, Zionist network that Canadian politicians were then echoing about what had actually happened. Uh,
Yeah.
and so it was quite a, kind of a unique, I've never seen that situation where
Yeah, it's really something. But I think with that, it's that one thing that the protesters and the police have in common is we were both there, right? We both saw what happened. So it's also that, the police now are under this massive political pressure to make more arrests and crack down and this kind of thing. And so the police actually, like in the, fallout of this demonstration, have had to sort of tone down expectations in terms of how many people they're going to arrest and what the consequences will be. Like they've said, for example, that they can spend police resources looking into people who broke a couple of windows, but most of the time those people end up with a fine. Criminal charges don't necessarily stick. Like it is, look, but they tolerate, auto theft, for example, because it's just property, right? There's tons more and more cars being stolen all the time. So for them to put like significant resources after people broke a couple windows, it's maybe not the most productive use of the police time, but they're under this political pressure. And I think that, that's maybe one of the reasons that they should correct the record about the cars, because if they're under pressure to arrest people for setting their cars on fire, but it's actually them who set them on fire, like, there's a way to tone down expectations in terms of the number of arrests that are likely to be seen. But it's also like a complete, political like involvement in policing operations, like to demand arrests and to demand like, more accountability and that kind of thing. It's interfering in the police work.
and Legault, the premier, I believe on Wednesday, so 3 or 4, 5 days after, and when the basic facts were pretty well established, he came out again and repeated basically he needed I think he used the word voyou, I don't know the criminal, I don't know how you translate that exactly, but you need basically calling for more arrests and amplifying the pressure. And today, Friday, when we're doing this on November 29th, Anthony Housefather, the arch-Zionist liberal MP, um, a couple of mayors of Côte Saint-Luc, and Rabbi Pupko, who's on the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, are meeting with the Montreal head of the Montreal police to sort of put pressure. And they're trying to use this incident to try to shut down the Saturday and Sunday demonstrations, which have been going on for 14 months now, against Israel's genocidal policies.
Look,
So
I think that there's people who want to ban all demonstrations, right? I was listening to QEB radio there, the Journal de Montréal radio, and Dutrisac there was talking about, that we've had enough of this, we've had enough of their Palestinian flags, like suggesting that like all these demonstrations be shut down. I actually had to see the chief of police telling him, well, sir, we live like in a society with laws and with the right to protest and stuff like that, and what you're calling for is essentially complete silencing, like of
you're calling for fascism, you're calling for an authoritarian state. I
yeah,
mean,
exactly.
that's sort of central to democracy, and we should have very wide berth of allowance with regards to protests. And I think there's even some people on the left for instance, the convoy thing in Ottawa a couple of years ago, I think they took a mistaken position in trying to support the idea of suppressing. We should go for much
Yeah.
broader. Now, that's a sort of
That's what's kind of scary about this is that by, having this rhetoric that's completely detached from the facts, you wonder how far they can take it, right? Will they take it all the way to declaring emergency measures and banning all protests based on events that they fabricated themselves and that did not actually take place? Like it is po anything's possible.
and the Zionist movement in Canada and globally to a certain extent, but are clearly want this. Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, B'nai B'rith, they are openly calling for repression of all demonstrations. That's why a few windows being broken, they were able to blow it up to such a big deal. Because they think that just marching is a big deal, that just marching is a crime. And so marching with the Palestinian flag and then a window being broken, I mean, that's like they actually referred to it as crystal knock and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. Well,
So they
also having Hamas labeled as a terrorist group itself, to say that the Palestinian leadership are terrorists and that nobody should support them or anything, right, is a genocidal language that can lead to this kind of thing, right? Like, when they're saying, oh, well, now anybody who's protesting for Palestine is protesting for Hamas and therefore they're supporting a terrorist group and stuff like that. Like, it's very dangerous to see like all of these barriers to free speech that are being put into place and all this demonization. Like, this is the genocidal rhetoric we see right in front of us.
and they succeeded, right? They got the government to recently
Well,
put
this,
Sammy Dune. I know
you're right.
partially succeeded in some of these things. They got the government to put Sammy Dune, Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, on Canada's terrorist list. It's basically a grassroots group based in Vancouver who's been at the center of the mobilizations of Vancouver. And then you saw just about 10 days ago, the Vancouver police did a extreme overreach operation where they busted down the door basically of Charlotte Cates, the coordinator of Sammy Dune's her home, and they used stun grenades, and they could have just came and knocked. It's just a home in
Yeah. Can you
Vancouver.
tell us what their justification was for adding this group to the terror list?
Oh, they just claimed that Sammy Dune was linked to the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine is on Canada's terrorist list. They don't even claim Sammy. Nobody claims that Sammy Dune is involved in any form of violence,
Right.
including even property destruction or anything like that. They just claim that they have associations, and the terrorist list doesn't allow for it doesn't allow for habeas corpus of like a legal response. The government can just put it on your group on the list, and then it's against the law to assist that organization, to finance it, to da da da. So that's and the Zionist movement's been pushing for that for a number of years and very aggressively in the recent months. And they know, and then now they're using Sammy Dune's being put on the terrorist list to say anyone who had connections to Sammy Dune, they basically need to be, investigated and stuff like that. So this is the authoritarian, the Zionist push is not, there's many elements going on this. We saw in Ottawa over the weekend arrests of a bunch of Palestine solidarity protesters. So it's happening in different places. I would actually argue that the Montreal police have been certainly compared to the 2012 student strike and more specifically the 2015 student strike, they have been quite respectful of our charter rights of the Palestine mobilizations, contrary to many things they've done in the past. And but we are seeing this real push by Zionist forces to go at the Palestine solidarity movement and really the anti-genocide or anti-Holocaust movement. But now, just before finishing, I want to maybe the final point I want to kind of bring up in all of this, which I think is maybe the most important and exciting element in this whole discussion of what's happening, is that to me, one of the things that comes out, okay, so you have this really impressive student strike. This is amazing. This is, I think, historic, like I said, in the history of Quebec student strikes. Now, just so happens, the NATO summit happens to take place at the same time the student strike happens. It was very impressive to me, not somebody who's very distant from the student movement at this point, to see how they took on NATO and to what the exciting element of this is it suggests that this popular uprising against Canada's complicity in genocide that's been going on for the last 14 months, that it is maybe broadening its analysis, it's broadening its critique, and it's taking on, Canadian foreign policy more generally, NATO, and you could say Canadian imperialism, however you want to define that. And so they really, fully embarked in obviously this multiple Friday mobilizations. There was apparently four different demonstrations against NATO on the Friday, and then there was another one on the Saturday, and then there was the counter summit on the Sunday. But they got behind it. They did all these workshops at UQAM. They marched. I guess maybe a little bit about your assessment of that question and yeah, I guess maybe just sort of back to a little bit of the question of the anti-NATO mobilization that you've been involved in over the past couple months.
Yeah. Well, I think the anti-NATO mobilization is building, and I think that, with Palestine, it's led a lot of people to take a critical look of Canadian foreign policy and even to come out and protest in the streets about it. So I think that's a positive step forward because, there's a lot of people who think that Canadian foreign policy is, based on human rights and democratic values and this kind of thing. But when you look at it and you look what we're supporting internationally, the fact that we're escalating this proxy war against Russia, the fact that we're supporting Israel, like there's a lot of really evil Canadian foreign policy that's out there in the world that's having impacts on a lot of people. We've got a huge weapons industry here with, being shipped to all kinds of different places. So the fact that people are taking note of this, to a large extent because of what's happening in Palestine, I think is something very positive, right? And I like to be optimistic, right? Because I find in activism, it's very easy to become pessimistic and that kind of thing. But so these mobilizations, I think, are a turning point. Right. We've never seen, at least I've never seen this many people in the streets protesting for NATO and all this attention put towards it. There's some articles about, that these protests were against NATO and that kind of thing. So I think it's positive that way. And I think that anything that can get people to take a critical look of what Canada is doing abroad is certainly a step in the right direction.
At his speech to the NATO Assembly on the Monday, Trudeau said that we have to keep going, keep putting money into the NATO proxy war in Ukraine because Russia had inserted the long dormant idea, I'm basically quoting here, that might makes right. So he's claiming that Russia, I guess 33 months ago when it invaded, that was the first instance of might makes right in global affairs since World War II. And to me, if you look at what Canada's enabling and Justin Trudeau's enabling in terms of Gaza, the Holocaust he's enabling there, the idea that Justin Trudeau's motivation in Ukraine is to protect human rights and to protect sovereignty is just, it's a joke, right? Like, you don't enable this Holocaust in Gaza and then you're really like, care about, sovereignty. So I think to me, it seems really hard. There are a lot of people who I think got on board for the NATO, very simplistic NATO narrative about what was going on in Ukraine. And they kind of bought into that. Now with what's gone on, what they've seen Canada do in Gaza, it's pretty hard to believe that the motivation is some sort of benevolent policy in Ukraine. And
Yeah, it takes a long time to get past all of the framing that we've been fed through the mainstream media. And, La Presse had come to a press conference that you were at actually on the Monday. And when somebody said that Ukraine had, or NATO rather, had provoked the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the La Presse journalist blurted out, "That's Russian propaganda." And, later on, that same outlet wrote a column and they quoted me as saying that yes, NATO did provoke the invasion of Ukraine, and they called me a useful idiot for Putin for saying so, and that I had lost all credibility by saying that when so many anti-war activists have criticized NATO for the role that they're playing in that conflict, and but this is just one example of the kind of framing that we see constantly from the mainstream media in Canada, and it really takes a certain amount of time and effort to break through that for people because they've been fed information leading them in only one direction for so long.
Yes, for sure. And so I think that this mobilization, I think we should see some serious positives from that in terms of bridging the Palestine movement in the broader anti-war, anti-NATO movement. Obviously, we have to be concerned with where things are going in terms of the authoritarian response. I'd like to just thanks a lot for coming on to talk about this. Alex Tyrrell, leader of the Green Party of Quebec, and a anti-war activist here in Montreal. Thank you.
Thank you.